Geare, hello and Guten Tag. Welcome to Berlin Wall Stories, an exhibition that was commissioned by the German Embassy in Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It explores the perspectives of 10 unique people and their relationship with the Berlin Wall, a concrete wall that once divided East and West Berlin, and the border strip that ran between the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. You're about to hear a recorded interview with one of our participants who shared their personal Mauergeschichte, their Berlin Wall story. Enjoy and viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
I'm Judith Geare, and I trained as a German teacher. I worked for many years at the Goethe Institute, but it was before my Goethe Institute days when I first went to Germany on a DAAD scholarship. So I spent 3 semesters at the University of Trier, and then I had the wonderful opportunity to spend a summer in Weimar, in what was then East Germany, the DDR. And after that, I had a year in Vienna in Austria.
Right.
So my first experience of German-speaking countries was quite eclectic.
So can you say you were still a beginner when you were in Weimar?
No. I had already completed a degree in German. So I'd done an honours degree in German in New Zealand, which meant that I could read anything. I could understand a lot, and when I first went, I was very diffident about speaking, and I was in that ridiculous phase where you try and formulate a perfect sentence, and the moment has always passed, so people think you're very quiet, when anybody who knows me knows that I'm anything but quiet, but my mind wasn't working fast enough, and in the end, I had to be really severe with myself and just say something, even if it's not perfect. So I did, and that was how I started to improve. So, but that's interesting. I wasn't a beginner, but I still had some defects, because when I got to Weimar, the first thing they did was to test all the foreign Germanisten, and they discovered that I could not produce a proper German R. And so I was given a set of exercises. I was sent into the language lab, and I was not to emerge until I stopped trilling like an Austrian and producing a decent German R. And I am so grateful. I think nobody else would ever have said there was something wrong with my German.
No,
but they were quite right, and I'm really, really grateful that...
Can you give us an example? How did that sound before and after?
Before, I learned my German from an Austrian, so I often got away with a r at the front of your mouth, and I don't know, maybe I was even producing an English r at times. How terrible. But no, in Weimar, the foreign Germanisten were all given the chance to improve, and I'm deeply grateful that I learned how to say r, which has stood me in good stead when that's overdoing it, of course, but when you're teaching German, and I never make people feel bad if they do it, because if you say r, then they'll say, what a charming English accent, and if they say r, they'll think that you're Austrian. But if you want to be perfect and want to be able to do a r, then I know how to get it out of you, involving gargling and mirrors and making really funny faces in front of a mirror. But yes.
Thank you. It's really good advice for everybody who learns German at the moment, or who might like to learn German.
Absolutely.
You can get there.
You can get there. And also there's a huge spectrum. Wherever you go between sort of Berlin and the depths of Bavaria, somebody will be doing it the way you do it. So anything's acceptable. But, perfect High German, if you're going to work for the Goethe Institute, you want to speak perfect High German if you need to.
That brings us to the next level of your work. So you were the head of the German language department.
That's right. I started as a teacher. I remained a teacher for most of my life, but officially I became the head of the German language department, which meant that I was not just looking after language courses in Wellington and then in Auckland, but also supporting German teachers in New Zealand throughout the country, which was really exciting and gave me contact with school students again, which is how I'd started my German teaching career. So that was really exciting. And also, of course, the cultural program, which was not specifically part of the language department that I was running, but we're a small enough institute that we're all allowed to do a bit of everything, and I was fascinated too by the cultural program that the Goethe Institute offered.
So arts and culture is something you really enjoy as well?
Always have, yes.
German or New Zealand arts and culture?
All aspects. I mean, I didn't start learning German until I was 15 or 16 at secondary school, and I only did 2 years at secondary school before going to university, so it was always a struggle. I mean, we studied literature right from the start, but getting through a decent-sized piece of German literature was a huge undertaking for me, just because of the smallness of my vocabulary after only 2 years at school. So it was always a struggle, but I also studied English literature and French literature, and I've loved theatre in all its aspects since I was about 7, when I went to see Aotearoa singing Porgy and Bess, which changed my life.
You're still a teacher, aren't you?
I am still a teacher. I mean, the aspect of my work that I've always enjoyed most is teaching. And teaching the German language became my sort of the main aspect of teaching, and I just love doing it. And people think that it will become boring to teach beginners, and I have never found it, because every beginner is different. Every beginner manages to challenge me with some question they ask. You know, even in the first half year of learning German, I learn more about the German language all the time. I do hope my learners learn something too, but I know that I do. And it's so wonderful. And it's wonderful when you see people becoming confident and going off and being able to make a life with German partners or German firms where they're working. It's just a delight.
Right, yeah. I can confirm that you have... enhanced so many lives with that language, I guess, because you have so much passion. And I can also admit that Judith is someone who will correct my grammar, for example, because it's always the case, perhaps, that if someone who learns the language is much better in grammar and everything that comes along with it than the native speaker sometimes.
Well, not necessarily much better. I mean, for years I felt mortified that I wasn't a native speaker, and so I would prepare for hours for every eventuality in the fear that somebody might ask a question that I didn't know the answer to. And it was such a relief for me to see native speakers humming and hawing over questions at times and thinking, oh, you don't have to be perfect all the time. And the other thing you can do as a non-native speaker is admit to what you don't know and admit to how hard it is sometimes to work out whether a word is der, die or das, particularly if it's a new word in the language. You know, words like muffin or crumpet that come up and suddenly go into the German language, and what are they? So I think as you get more confident, you can admit that you're not all-knowing, and that's quite reassuring for your students, I think. But also you do know their problems. You do know how building up the German grammar from nothing and not being able to just rely on, that sounds right. Well, you know, you haven't got a history that allows you to know that sounds right. You need to know what is right.
You need to stick to the rules, yeah.
Exactly, but also not be hamstrung by them as I was, so that you can't actually say anything because you're so busy thinking about how to make everything perfect. You need to have that combination of blurting out something that will get your communication across and knowing that if you think about it a little bit, you could actually make that communication more perfect, but finding a middle point where you don't not say something because you haven't quite perfected it yet.
Right, yeah. Some relaxation has to come off.
Absolutely. You know, and if somebody's running across the road and they're about to be hit by a car, nobody's going to complain about your endings.
Perfect. Good advice.
Yes.
Well, now let's dive into a little bit of a history here. You have a very special Berlin Wall story, not so much related to the wall itself, but you were a person from New Zealand who had gone to Germany and then was invited into the GDR, into the communist part at the time of the divided Germany. Maybe take us along a little bit on that journey. How did it actually happen that you ended up there?
Like so much of my life, I fell into a wonderful rabbit hole. It was so exciting. I had a DAAD scholarship and I was studying at the University of Trier, right over in the west of West Germany, and having a wonderful time discovering a new culture and developing my language. And quite by chance, one of my professors from Dunedin had booked a place at a Hochschulgermanistenkonferenz, a conference for foreign Germanists, German language and literature experts, in Weimar. It was actually organised by the University of Jena, but it was to be held in Weimar, Goethe's home. Now, he had intended to attend this conference himself. He was in Germany with his 2 small children who were playing up and could not be left with their grandmother. So he looked around to see what New Zealanders were lurking about in West Germany and came upon me and sent me a postcard saying, would I be interested in spending a summer in Weimar? And I have to admit, I nearly missed the opportunity because his handwriting wasn't very good. I didn't read it as Weimar the first time, and I thought, I think I've got other plans for the summer. What's he talking about? And it wasn't until, in a moment of boredom, I gazed a bit longer at the scrawl and thought, that word could be Weimar. If it is, I want to go. And so I wrote back and said, yes, I'd be delighted to go to Weimar. What did I have to do? If I'd realised that it was a conference of rather high-powered German experts, whereas I was a recent postgraduate from New Zealand, I don't know, I might have been a bit more nervous about it. But anyway, off I go to Weimar and end up meeting with people from all over the world. My geography improved out of sight. I mean, I had no idea which countries were socialist and which countries were not. And we were greeted every day as die Damen und Herren aus den sozialistischen Ländern und die Damen und Herren aus den nicht sozialistischen Ländern. And the lovely thing was that half the people there had no idea where New Zealand fitted in. So I kind of moved in a kind of central position. And it was lovely because I wasn't banished with the American Germanistin to stay in the Hotel zum Elefanten, but I was put into a Wohngemeinschaft, into a flatting situation with the Polish delegation, which was fabulous because, again, I knew nothing about Poland. I learned heaps about it while I was there. I also discovered that they were all Poles number 1, Catholics number 2, and Socialists only number 3. And that was interesting for me as well. And at our first getting to know you evening, we all picked names, and I picked Elsa. So I had to find my Lohengrin, who happened to be the sort of, I was told, the head of the KGB who was looking after the Soviet delegation. So he and I danced the night away, the first night at this conference. And again, all of it was sort of the naivety I brought to it meant that I was discovering things about geography, things about politics, and somehow it was such an easy situation. It was interesting. There were Germanisten from the whole world, just not from the Bundesrepublik, not from West Germany. But there were a lot of West Germans there who were teaching at universities in America. And the lovely thing was that when we were all tested and sent to the lab to get over our deficits, half of these West German Germanisten were sent to get rid of their dreadful American accents that they brought to the conference. And all of these things, I mean, in my naivety and youth, I just found everything terribly amusing and wonderfully stimulating somehow. And it was the most fabulous conference. We had lectures on everything you could imagine. They started at 7 in the morning. They went on till 11 at night. Wow. Some of the skeptics said it was to prevent us, getting up to any nonsense because we were always so tired. But again, as a young person, I was perfectly capable of getting up to nonsense after 11 p.m. and still being at my 7 a.m. lecture the next morning, which I would now find rather difficult. And I met the most amazing people, not just the other Germanisten from all around the world, but also people from the DDR. And what absolutely blew me away was their level of knowledge. I was asked questions about New Zealand that there was no way I could answer. People, possibly because of travel restrictions, were really, really interested in exotic and distant parts of the world. And as I say, I was, wherever I went, people wanted to know everything I could tell them about New Zealand and a lot more that unfortunately I couldn't. And they were all so warm-hearted and interested and exciting that in spite of myself, a lot of my prejudices were being kind of crumbling down as I spent longer than the few hours that I had spent when we visited Berlin from Trier. I would often go over to East Berlin, but you could only stay what was left of the day and get home before midnight. So it was quite different actually living and being able to go out drinking with local people in Weimar.
So we were kind of immersed
absolutely.
into a community there.
Absolutely. And on the one hand, we were getting lectures and lots of information from the official side, and on the other hand, we were out there drinking at night with the unofficial side. And, it was just one of the most exciting things that I did. Those 6 weeks I spent in Weimar were more intense and instructive and interesting and stimulating probably than 6 months that I'd spent in Trier, a city I adore, of course.
Yeah. How old were you when you went to
How old
Weimar?
was I? It was 1978 and I was born in 1955. So I must have been 23, 24. Yes.
Right, yeah, it must have been very exciting for someone who's in their
Hugely
early
exciting.
20s.
Hugely exciting. And also, coming from small town New Zealand, I often felt that I was younger than people of the same age in West Germany at least.
Right. Yeah,
Yes.
because that would be my next question. How was that experience like, coming from a country so far away from Europe as well, and then having to compare West and East, because you ended up in the West, in the Bundesrepublik, West Germany first, and then you had that time spent in Weimar for 6 weeks. If you would have to compare those two parts, what comes to mind for you?
Well, something that I've observed since very clearly is that New Zealanders going to West Germany adapt to the affluence of West Germany very, very quickly. That becomes the norm. And so often people who do go across to East Berlin, for example, in those days, or possibly to Weimar, what struck them was the difference between the two countries at the time, just the difference in affluence, really. But the funny thing is, when you look at your photographs, East Germany looked much more like New Zealand of the time than West Germany did. But somehow we spend 5 minutes in West Germany, adapt to the affluence, and are absolutely shocked by the age of the cars in East Germany, which is very similar to the age in those days. I mean, the late 70s, a street in Oamaru, where I come from, looked very like a street in Weimar. Except the buildings weren't so picturesque. Well, actually, no, there are quite picturesque buildings in Oamaru too.
Yeah.
If you're in the right bit of Oamaru, exactly. Yeah. So it is funny that adapting to affluence and then being shocked by the contrast, whereas when we come from New Zealand, we weren't shocked by the contrast. We just very quickly adapted to the affluence, which surprised me.
Interesting. And been in contact with people from the East German side, because probably most of the visitors who had gone over a checkpoint into the East in Berlin would have not really had the chance to chat or to hang out.
Exactly, to hang. I mean, the hanging
German
out was the really, really exciting thing. I mean, yes, so I've lost it, but I had a little letter that was written to me by one of the chaps that we drank with one night, and he addressed me as Wertes Fräulein, which I found, but apparently that was quite normal. That was sort of quite a normal address. But I mean, I was very excited to be addressed as a Wertes Fräulein.
Very formal.
When he was answering some question or something that we'd asked one night as we drank into the wee small hours in an underground pub in Weimar.
You brought us a few photos today. Maybe we can have a look at those photographs. So that was you. That's a picture of yourself.
Yes, I mean, as I say, I was put up in a house. So somebody must have vacated a house that became then the flat for a group of about 6 of us. And I think it was 5 Polish women and me. And there weren't quite enough beds. I shared a double bed with one of the Polish women. And and as I say, I learned a lot more about Poland in those weeks than anything else. And yes, it's just a typical 70s look. And to be honest, it doesn't look that different from the room that I stayed in Trier in West Germany. But I do remember. Yes, now looking at my Polish friends from that time, one of them must have run out of shampoo, and she asked to borrow my shampoo, which was fine. And of course, I gave her my conditioner as well. And I remember her looking at it and saying, "What's this capitalist nonsense?" she said. I said, "Oh, you put it on after the shampoo and it makes it easier to comb." And she rolled her eyes and roared with laughter at this capitalist nonsense that I'd fallen for. And that was, for me, just symbolic of the whole time, that, there were differences and we laughed about them, and it was wonderful.
Did you also have like some, if you like, political debates about where they came from, or like Poland was part of the East Bloc as well?
Certainly with the Poles, it became very clear that they were Polish nationalists, number one, Roman Catholics, number two, which surprised me, and socialists, number three. And, they were very disdainful of the much more party line people from other countries. And things like, the Yemen I mean, I had no idea which side the Yemen would be on, that sort of thing. You know, that the socialists from Yemen was very exciting for me to discover. But also the people that we actually met. One of the lecturers that we had was an absolutely beautiful blonde woman who lectured so sensitively on literature. And her lectures appealed particularly, well, they appealed to me hugely, but there was a huge group of American Germanistan who went to her lectures, and we became sort of her groupies. And one day she invited us to her home for afternoon tea, which was lovely. And when we finally found the place and went up the drive of this rather gorgeous house with this large car parked outside, I thought, it's quite obvious to me that this person is on the right side of the regime. But it wasn't until we were sitting round with our teacups and she was talking about, when she first saw the light and saw that Marxismus-Leninismus was really the answer to the world's problems, that suddenly music appeared because all the Americans' teacups started rattling as they started trembling at the thought that they were having afternoon tea at the home of a Marxist-Leninist, which again, me and my naivety, I just found it hilariously funny and realised what prejudices we have, that if you can be sensitive about literature, you must be a capitalist imperialist. You can't possibly be a socialist. And, these things I found just so fascinating and interesting and amusing at the time. It was just such a wonderful, intense, beautiful golden summer in Weimar. And, I could go and see Goethe's garden house. And it was a magical, magical time. And I felt all the time, every day I was learning something new, understanding something. Another thing that was hilarious, I mean, I must have brought more prejudices with me than I thought, because I thought of myself as a good left-wing, definitely open to socialism person. But I remember one day we'd taken a bus, I think we'd been to Naumburg, and we'd been somewhere else, and somehow I'm thinking of the older woman that Goethe may or may not have had an affair, Charlotte von Stein. There was something to do with Charlotte von Stein. Anyway, we were coming home in the dark in our bus, and suddenly the bus pulled off the road, and really heavy vehicles, one after another, thundered past. And I remember thinking, tanks. But no, they were combine harvesters. The fleet of combine harvesters was moving from the south, where the harvest first was. Mm-hmm. Instead of there being a combine harvester for every second farm, there was a fleet of combine harvesters that started in the south and harvested and moved up the country, which struck me as an incredibly sensible way of harvesting. And it opened up all sorts of discussions about the collectives and the farms, which I all found very convincing. But it was so funny that my first reaction was tanks, and in fact it was combine harvesters.
Does that maybe tell us that there is a bit of a fear inside as well, that things could have gone wrong, or that the police could have stopped you and asked you, and was there like a silent feeling of, you're still in this country?
Absolutely. I mean, that had been instilled on me by my West German host family and friends, when they heard that I was going to Weimar and that I was excited about going to Weimar and that I was looking forward to going to Weimar. They were all very, be very careful and things, they're all communists over there. And there was definitely, and again, in my youth and naivety, I laughed it off, but something of it was there in the same way as, because of the border checks when you went across. I mean, I'm the sort of person who, if I see a traffic cop on a road, I assume that I'm doing something wrong. I always have a huge wave of guilt, even if I'm keeping to the speed limit and have my registration, And so police checks and border crossings are not the most pleasant thing. So there's a level of tension, I think, there. And I think however much you think you're open and unprejudiced, you can't help but pick up some of the baggage that's piled on you by people around you who tell you that's right. I mean, my landlady's reaction was not that they're all communists. She said, but they're all Russians over there, she said. And, to discover that these Russians all spoke beautiful German and were in fact completely German. But it was a fascinating time for me, and I'm just so grateful that I had that experience.
Did it change you and your view on Germany at the time? I mean, you knew that Germany was divided for the very reason, but how did it probably educate you about the country, and how did it change your view on the country?
Oh, hugely. I mean, it made me want to spend much more time there, because not just Weimar, which is a lovely little place, but Jena was fascinating. Naumburg, the Wartburg, there was so much to see. It made me want to stay longer. And of course, we were lucky because we did have VIP status, so we could travel quite freely, except that we had to do it between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. So that
that was a rule. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I've always been a terribly law-abiding person. I mean, we were expected, because I was going at somebody else's expense, I really didn't feel that I could wag my session. So I did feel that, between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. I was meant to be doing the right thing, and everything else had to happen, in the dark of the night, as it were, which was very, very exciting, yes.
How did you experience the crossing of the border? Because there's lots of different experiences, I suppose. And probably we stick with Weimar, or I don't know, did you cross in Berlin and then went to Weimar, or did you cross somewhere between...
I think I went more. I don't think I went through Berlin this time, because I'd done that repeatedly. I think I went across a lower crossing, so somewhere near Göttingen. I think we went across, and I think I was quite relaxed this time because it was sort of an organised bus trip, and I found it much less sort of. I mean, it was I never experienced it as scary, but when I was crossing by myself in Berlin, I would always have this kind of worry that I might have foolishly done something wrong, or have something that I shouldn't have, or wouldn't be able to answer a question. Whereas in this case, it was sort of a bus, and it was handled by the Reiseleiter, so it was not a problem at all. The only thing that did happen was that at one stage my passport was taken away, and I'd very foolishly left my card for travelling cheaply on trains in it. And when it came back, it was gone. So I remember feeling a little petulant about that. But I mean, that was my silly fault, leaving it in my passport. I mean,
but they never searched your bag?
They never searched my bag. No, there was no. And that the whole Weimar trip, from the moment we were sort of invited to the Hochschulgermanistenkonferenz, we were given VIP treatment, which was, I mean, I was very conscious as a early 20s student how valuable that was, and so I was very excited by that and by this chance. And I did feel it was sort of a once in a lifetime chance. I think that's why I didn't mind not getting very much sleep, because I just wanted to make the most of the time that I was there.
Right. Did you get an impression that you were spied on, or that the whole conference was like full of Stasi people?
Isn't that funny? I mean, we may well have been, but no, at that time I didn't really know the word Stasi. I didn't think about that at all. There was a lot of sympathy for the Soviet delegation. There was definitely the feeling that they had their minders, and that they were being kept from joining us on our nightly escapades to pubs and talking with local people and having a wonderful time. There was tension. There was only one person from Vietnam there who seemed to be also part of the sort of Soviet. We felt that they were being watched. Again, I mean, I was probably naive. We probably all were being watched, but I didn't feel as if I was, and I felt as if I had this incredible freedom as a New Zealander from the other end of the world. Nobody knew which side I was on. Everybody assumed that, quite rightly, I was completely harmless and naive and gormless. So it gave me that incredible feeling of freedom, which was, years later when I went back to Weimar just before the Fall of the War in 1988, I was much more aware of things and much more nervous and tense, I think, partly because I was organising my own trip, but partly because I knew a bit more, or I had been infiltrated with more prejudice by then. But that golden summer in Weimar just felt like being somewhere exciting where people wanted to inform me and help me and show me a different side of life.
It's a very unique experience, I suppose, for a young Kiwi girl at the time. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I feel so privileged. I feel so privileged to have, had had that
You brought a
experience.
book with you because I asked you for a few things you might have kept from that time. And can you maybe tell us more about this book here?
Well, I mean, what I bought was, I bought a book because it was small, and at the time I was terribly conscious that I was a nomad, that I was travelling, that I didn't want to weigh myself down with quantity. So I bought a little book for children, which I thought, as I'm planning to be a teacher, it might be useful for my teaching in the future. It was written by Peter Hux, whose dramatical work I had read when I was studying Germany, so a name I knew, a children's book, and it was small and light and incredibly cheap. That was the other thing that I loved about going across to East Berlin whenever I was there, that books were so cheap compared to in the West, and definitely compared to New Zealand. So that was another sort of warm feeling I had about the DDR, that books were valued but were made available to people at a reasonable cost and not very expensively. And I noticed that inside I've written my name and then DDR, 1978. So it was obviously meaningful to me. And you know,
what's the story in the book, briefly?
It's delicious. It's called Metamorphos, a little girl called Metamorphos, and of course she can change her shape, so that's why she's called, as in, from metamorphosis. And she's a child with an imagination and an ability to change her form, which is just absolutely delightful, I think.
Amazing, thank you. Coming probably to East Berlin, you also got to see the Berlin Wall, I guess.
I did. Whenever I went whenever I went to Berlin, I would cross over into East Berlin because I had studied Brecht at university and was completely enamoured of many of his plays, and so the chance to go and see the Berliner Ensemble performing a play by Brecht was always a huge attraction for me.
Maybe we have to explain here that Brecht was based in the Eastern German part, in the DDR.
Exactly. Brecht covered all his bases, though. I mean, he kept his money in a Swiss bank account. He had a West German passport or an American passport, but he did base himself in the East, and the Berliner Ensemble had a way of performing his plays that he approved of, and I found his theory so fascinating. I really wanted to see the plays performed by the Berliner Ensemble as he would have wanted, I fondly imagined. And I'd even acted in Herr Puntilau und sein Knecht Marti in Dunedin, so the chance to see that play on the stage by the Berliner Ensemble was really exciting. And I remember I didn't acquire a lot of things at this time because of my nomadic lifestyle and my belief that things were not important. I changed later on. But hanging in the Berliner Ensemble was a huge wall hanging done by Picasso with a dove and people of different coloured skins, a sort of a peace to people of the whole world. Looking at it now, I don't actually find it particularly aesthetic, but it was really meaningful for me at the time. And it hung in the Berliner Ensemble, and you could buy a scarf with that motif. And I did buy that scarf, and I kept it for years. And I'm not quite sure when I lost it, but I cannot find it now. But that image has stayed with me. And I don't know whether Picasso actually painted it for the Berliner Ensemble, but certainly, if you Google Berliner Ensemble Picasso motive, this is what comes up. So there is some connection between Picasso and this motif and the Berliner Ensemble.
Yeah. So it appears to me that arts and theatre and music have really made your life
huge. And I have to admit a ridiculous thing, but going across to East Berlin in those days, I found, as a New Zealander, I found it so peaceful compared to West Berlin. And I had all these little corners between the border crossing and the Berliner Ensemble where I could sit in the sun and think and do things. And I have to admit that when the wall came down and I went across and my little quiet nooks were no longer quiet anymore, I was terribly disappointed. Not that, I think they should have left the Berlin Wall up just for me, but there were things that disappointed me when my quiet little nooks were no longer quiet little nooks anymore.
Interesting. How did you feel about the fall of the Berlin Wall? Probably where were you when it happened?
I was back in New Zealand. I had been there the year before. I had been in 1988. And in fact, I'd been really stupid because in 1988, there was already a different feeling. And I felt completely relaxed. I didn't have that kind of nervous feeling that I had when I got older than my Weimar years, but before this. And I remember I was teaching in New Zealand at the time, and I desperately wanted to have a photo of a double-decker train because we don't have double-decker trains in New Zealand. And I remember somewhere on a platform, I think it was in Weimar, I took a photograph of a double-decker train, and then I had a border guard come in and ask for my camera and ask for me to destroy the photograph because I was too close to the border to be photographing things. And I remember talking very fast about being a teacher from New Zealand, and I think I got away with it because I think I was able to show my students that double-decker train. But I was really surprised because I'd completely forgotten the whole issue, whereas earlier I would never have dreamt of pulling out a camera and just taking a photograph without thinking very carefully about where I was and whether I should. Right. So 1988, I'd been there, and somehow there was a feeling of change in the air already. So when in 1989 it happened, I mean, it was exciting and it was surprising, and we had all those images of people saying Wahnsinn, Wahnsinn. But very quickly, voices like Christa Wolf, spoke out about the speed and what might be lost. And certainly as a woman, I'd always been very impressed by the legislation for women in East Germany, and which was much better than in the West. And things like that were eroded by of course the wall had to come down. And of course, and in the wider history of things, it happened more peacefully and better than a lot of things around the world. But it still wasn't perfect. And
Sure.
there were things that were lost. I mean, the whole Stasi thing was pretty new to me. I hadn't ever really, that in retrospect, there was more that was negative. But I think I spent a lot of my time countering the negativity, because the negativity that came was prejudice and just they're different and they're not capitalists, and and I think there's a lot to counter there.
So you made your own mind up.
Exactly, exactly. And I made it up out of ignorance in a lot of ways. There were lots of things I didn't know about. Yes. So, I may have gone too far in another direction. But I just think you're right. You do have to observe and accept and not dismiss a whole country as, being of a nationality that they're not. My landlady telling me they were all Russian was sort of,
Yeah, no, it was. It's good to hear a very personal story that goes in a different direction than the stories we usually hear about the angst and the danger. And,
yes.
It's good to... Thank you for sharing this very special experience. The last question I would like to ask you, or one of the last questions, is how was that received, sticking to the fall of the Berlin Wall? How was that received in New Zealand? Did you get a feeling of how people reacted to that here, or did it even play any role, or was it too far away?
No, it was definitely big. It led the news, night after night for at least a week, which in New Zealand is a very long time. Because I was a teacher of the German language and I was in contact with German-speaking people and German nationals, I possibly got more... I was definitely more interested than possibly the average New Zealander, but certainly it was big news. But I think in general it was, this is good, this is only good, this is the end of something that was only bad. And that sort of black and white look at it... is typical of being this far away, but also I think is typical of the attitude that the capitalist world had to the socialist world.
Do you still have connections in the East? Have you travelled there again? Can you compare it to 1978 or 1988?
I do tend to go back whenever I can, and sometimes I'm a wee bit sad. There are parts of Leipzig that I think, changed too fast and lost lovely things to create, malls like there are malls all around the world, things like that. But that's me. I'm a bit of a. I love being able to see where things have come from, and when one thing is swept away and replaced by another, which is international, I find that sad. But that's not the case everywhere. In Weimar, you can still find Bauhaus traces, you can still find Goethe's Gartenhaus, you can still find elements of the history right through, which is great, and even in Geare as well. And it's wonderful too that all of these places have now opened up to everybody and that, people can travel freely. But that travel freely thing is so funny because when I first travelled, I could still remember a time when you left New Zealand, you were only allowed to take a very small amount of New Zealand currency out of the country with you because otherwise you would be draining the resources of a country that wasn't wealthy. And the difference between that and having a travel restriction is very small, in fact. I mean, it meant that, and so many things that people condemn as, so evil and wicked, some of them are based on quite pragmatic ideas and aren't so different from your own experience, but somehow it's so easy just to paint them as black and bad.
Right. Last question would be, what do you hope for, in this part of the German history? Because I, as a German, received that here in New Zealand, most of the talk around German history is, of course, around the Second and First World War. So when we're now talking about a different part of, or a more recent part of that history, what is your wish for probably students or other New Zealanders to learn from this exhibition?
I mean, I think it's great that there's been such an exciting and complex history since then because it can't help but be fascinating and open people's eyes to the fact that there has been a lot since then and maybe reminding us that there was a lot before then as well. I mean, if we go back to the 19th century and if we go back further to Goethe and Schiller, Germany has such a complex and varied history. And I think anything that provides a door into that and looking at this country, which is not, it doesn't have the luxury of being an island with clearly defined borders. You have changing borders and all sorts of immigration in and out and travel and but it's such a complex thing. It's not easy. It's not black and white and therefore easy to turn into simplistic cheap novels.
Thank you. I would actually close here. If you don't have anything you would like to add, something that comes to your mind that we forgot.
Have we had half an hour already?
No, we had 42 minutes exactly. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and to get that glimpse into a very special story of a New Zealander who came to the GDR in the 70s.
Yes.
And had a wonderful time there, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Judith.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This was an interview recorded by the curator of the Berlin Wall Stories exhibition, Alexandra Falk. We hope you enjoyed it. There are 9 more recorded interviews in this playlist. Maybe you want to explore them as well. Thank you and bis bald.